Good evening to our colleagues in the UK, and a very warm welcome to everyone tuning in from other parts of the world. Thank you for joining us for this inaugural lecture, which promises to be a truly fascinating event. My name's Dean, and I'll be chairing today's session. And I'm delighted to see such a really diverse group of people here today as well. Before we begin, just a few quick bits of housekeeping. Could I please ask everyone to keep their microphones muted while our presenters are speaking? We're recording this session for the benefit of those who couldn't be here today. But if anybody's got any objections, then obviously please do let me know. In terms of structure, we'll have our presenters speak first, after which I'll join them for a brief discussion. We'll then open the floor to everyone for Q&A. I know many of you sent in questions before the event, so I'll be touching on some of those themes during our discussion, but rather than reading them out, I'd encourage you to ask your questions directly when we open the floor. As a reminder, the aim of this network is to really highlight the critical reality that the future of technology can't be shaped by STEM disciplines alone and requires the ethical, the historical, the human-centric interrogation that the arts and humanities can provide. And if anybody's interested in finding out about our speakers' research or their interest, then obviously please feel free to email me after the event and I can put you in touch. And I'll also ensure that links to any reference publications are circulated in a follow-up email after today's session. So let's get started. First, we have Dr. Ali-Reza Bhojani, Associate Professor in Islamic Ethics. Ali-Reza teaches Islamic law and ethics in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham, where he brings multidisciplinary approaches to Islamic intellectual traditions. Crucially for today's discussion, he's a research fellow at the Seattle-based nonprofit AI and Faith, which equips people to bring faith-based wisdom to the ethical AI conversation. His recent work is incredibly relevant to our theme today, including his publications on truth and regret, large language models, the Quran and misinformation, and his chapter Between Fear and Hope, AI Ethics in Islamic Thought. So please join me in welcoming our opening speaker, Ali-Reza. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Dean, and thanks to colleagues for joining the session. I'm looking forward to a conversation rather than a series of lectures. And delighted to be here and support this, what is a much needed and great initiative of bringing the humanities into conversations with these pressing questions around the development, uptake, regulation of artificial intelligence and related technologies. So some of my work is interested in the relationships between Islamic thought and artificial intelligence, both from the perspectives of how Islamic thought can inform questions emerging with the development of AI technologies, including concrete questions around AI ethics. I'm also very much interested in how developments in terms of the uptake of AI technologies is informing Islamic thought itself, both at a scholarly level and in terms of wider practice and understanding. But I wanted to just start with, rather than speaking initially about any of these concrete things that I've been studying, I wanted to start with a response to the question which Dean posed for this session. All right, so it was a Dean's invitation, and it was Dean's creative framing for this session. And the session asks, is AI our new God? So I just want to clarify initially my engagement with this question. Is I would guess most people would expect from somebody who's coming from the Islamic tradition and interested in Islamic thought. That's not I'm not engaging with that question literally, but I want to I think it's a useful question. Is AI our new God? If we want to think about the functional role of artificial intelligence, whether that be for believers or people of beyond faith, right? Because it allows us to ask questions about what we treat as both ultimate and ordinary, sources of meaning, authority, trust, and orientation. AI technologies are increasingly mediating knowledge, decision making, moral judgments, and really, really importantly for me, even human purpose. Right? So again, thinking about the framing that which Dean gave us, it made me think of a Quranic narrative. So there's an account in the Quran about the Prophet Abraham, and I want to just share this very, very briefly. Share this account of this particular story about the Prophet Abraham, of course, a shared prophet for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And how it can give us a critical disposition to about thinking about some of the developments in the uptake and development of AI. So in the Quran, in chapter 6, Abraham, after a critique of idolatrous practices, early on in his life, he observes the sun, the moon, and the stars. And on each occasion he asks, he starts with the stars, then he goes to the moon, and then he goes with the sun. In each case he asks, is this my Lord? Right? In the same way that we're asking, is AI a new God? No. Each of the stars, the moon and the sun, appears powerful, illuminating, awe-inspiring. Yet for Abraham, he points out that each is passing, each is contingent, right? And each is limited. So ultimately, Abraham rejects these as gods, in favor of that which does not set, that which is not passing, right? So AI technologies, both those which we have currently and those which seem to be, aspirationally for some technologists, are, again, displaying brilliance and power, right? They're awe-inspiring, but I think we need to recognize their limits and their proper functions, right? So, building on this analogy, we can think of AI as a contemporary celestial body, right? So AI in some ways resembles the stars, the moon, and the sun in the narrative which I've just shared. AI technologies illuminate, through data, insight, predictions, right? They appear, and especially I'm thinking about LLMs here, large language models, they appear comprehensive and authoritative. They inspire awe and often deference, right? Yet they are derivative, trained on past human data, and although mass data sets, particular data sets, which are of course context bound and orientated by material interests, driven by the logic of markets, corporate structures, and wider power structures, which involve, of course, the accumulation of data, mass accumulation of data, and associated consumption of resources, and at some levels simply directed to the accumulation of more data. Right? In the Quranic account which I've referred to, God is affirmed, a theistic vision of God, a monotheistic vision of God, is affirmed as the source of guidance and meaning. Actually possessing knowledge of all things, not subject to decay, limitation, and we might add, things like bias or deficiencies. Artificial intelligence, and emerging technologies, by contrast, they generate information. And again, I'm thinking specifically about LLMs. They generate information which is not equal to knowing. They generate information without understanding. They produce outputs without responsibility. The technologies themselves and typically the corporate structures behind them, all right, without responsibility. And they can amplify falsehood, as easily as they amplify truth. Right? So this gives us I think this can highlight for us some ethical tensions. Okay, what's happening when guidance, and I don't just mean theological guidance here, just ordinary guidance, is outsourced to systems without moral accountability and that have no sense of truth. And now our outsourcing, the mass uptake of the use of LLMs, okay, is sometimes conscious when we unwittingly rely on ChatGPT, okay, for example, for information, and is also this outsourcing is also unconscious. When our consumption of information is driven by algorithmic logics, which seek simply more engagement. Okay? So for Abraham in that narrative, he comes to particular theological conclusions, right? After describing the passing, fleeting, limited nature of the stars and the moon and the sun. And it leads him to, in the Quranic narrative at least, to responsibility, orientation, and trust in a transcendent source, which is beyond human manufacture. Right? Initially, this starts with his critique of idolatry, right? And I think this narrative, and theology, religious traditions more generally, can prompt us to check. And I think we need to do more than just check, even resist the reduction of human purpose to the accrual of efficiency, power, and accumulation. Right. So just as there is a urgency, deep urgency for shared thinking, across religious traditions and beyond religious traditions on the purposes of AI technologies and the specifics of AI ethics in terms of their development, regulation, and uptake, I think simultaneously there's an urgency for us to think and think again and articulate, the purpose of humankind, right? Of human ethics, and with a nod to the branding of this new network. I think we need attention to what it actually means to be humane. Yeah, and I will leave it there, pass it on to Jeremy, and hopefully we can come back for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Ali-Reza. I'm just going to bring up some slides here real quick.
Thank you, Ali-Reza, as well. While Jeremy is bringing up his slides, I'll introduce Jeremy. Dr. Jeremy Kidwell. He's Associate Professor in Philosophical Theology, who has been a member of the faculty at the university since 2016. He brings a truly unique trajectory to this discussion because prior to becoming an academic, he worked extensively in the tech industry, making the transition from teenage hacker to IT technician, server administrator, network security team leader, and trainer for a telecommunications company. Alongside theoretical interests in the philosophical implications of AI for human subjectivity, he's also engaged on a regular basis in practical tinkering and interaction with large language models, conducting speculative experiments at the boundaries of well-being, assistive technology, and companionship. So the floor is now over to Jeremy.
Cool. Thanks for the introduction. And I think I'll just kind of dive right in. And as I think the introduction suggested, part of the angle that I bring to this is a little bit unusual as a theologian, in that I've got my hands in the tech quite a lot. And so I've got a quite tangible sense of the kinds of quandaries and questions that I want to raise. It's not quite arm's length as it is for a lot of other Christian theologians, at least is my understanding. But let me just say, in terms of I think in the spirit of this network and what we're trying to inaugurate here, a big question that I have that I want to try to answer is what on earth do we even have to say about this? That is, I could say as philosophical and theological thinkers, but that more broadly for the humanities, because of course there are dozens of papers coming out every single day on the preprint networks, which are pretty interesting, a lot of times by computer scientists who are writing about philosophy, and I'm not sure anyone thinks they need us. So I think there's a really interesting question here for us to consider, just in terms of mapping out what are the kinds of domains of relevance. So I was thinking to myself, kind of what is it that a Christian ethicist might even actually have to say about AI, particularly generative AI and large language models as they've been emerging. So I've got four basic headings that I've come up with. I'm going to share in hopes that will kind of fertilize the discussion and maybe raise some questions. I'm not going to comment explicitly on my kind of position on all these things. in hopes that I'll kind of provoke some questions about the things that are interesting to people, and we can kind of dive into those specific ones. Okay, here we go. First one, and I'm going to kind of go in order of the things which I think probably are, it's least likely that an ethicist like me is going to have novel things to say. That's not to say that we don't have good things to say, but I think there's a difference between us needing to think new thoughts and just needing people to listen to the thoughts that we've already been saying for 50 years about just don't be mean and let's maybe pay attention to justice and not oppress people. So, okay, so the first one, I think, the first kind of heading in terms of what would an ethicist like me have to say about AI, is probably just the obvious ethical issues and the quandaries that I think probably pop up in the headlines a lot for everyone here. And this is about the kind of deployment of generative AI in public services, such as policing and courts, which has been ongoing for a long time, but also increasingly in education. You see lots of new narratives around how generative AI is going to replace people like me. What do you need lectures for? I mean, you can just ask Claude and get just the answers are just as good, which to be fair, they are sometimes. But also therapists, medical practitioners, doctors, and I guess by extension, there's questions here about the implications of work automation. And that's not new because we've had questions around robotics. Although I think Amazon has kind of proven that oppressed humans are cheaper than robots. So maybe that question got deferred and now it's come back up again. But I think also kind of deeper questions around alignment and justice and the ways that these large language models can be used, obviously in the last couple of weeks demonstrated by Elon Musk's ridiculous experiment Grok, to harm people. And whether that's through developing knowledge about violence or developing content which harms others, there's lots of opportunities for ethical conversations about how on earth we should have these technologies situated socially. And also in some of the kind of niche uses of the tech. And that comes around the kind of resurrection chatbots that bring back dead people, and the companion chatbots, which seek to kind of provide certain kinds of companionship. I think subreddit AI Soulmate is really interesting on this. And I don't have a settled view, so I'm happy for us to pick this up and maybe discuss it more later. Okay, so that's the first kind of heading. The second heading, I think, would probably be just straightforwardly how do Christians use generative AI? And I think this is particularly salient because, as a number of historians of technology have pointed out, it seems to be the case that Christians really like technology, especially Protestants, and they're always the early adopters, whether this is, printing presses or televangelism or Instagram, websites, whatever. It seems to be the case, and I've noticed this anecdotally with generative AI, people are adopting quite quickly. So there's some interesting questions here just around how are people using it, how should they, what kinds of pastoral guidance could we possibly offer in specific religious contexts. Okay, now we're starting to get into a little bit more of the edge cases, and here I show my colors as an environmental ethicist. One of the kind of big things that my career has been devoted to thinking about is how we should think about and regard other beings, and especially in the context of environmental ethics. A lot of the ways that we as humans prosecute harm towards not just other humans, but towards ecologies, rests on the ways that we have regard for the subjectivity of those other beings. And so a big part of that conversation, of course, is trying to grapple with how are animals meaningful subjects for us to be in relationship with and have regard for, or trees, or mountain ranges, or landscapes. And this carries forward also into disability theology and some of the work that I've been doing around disability and neurodivergence. So I think there's some really interesting questions that we've already raised in those contexts, which could be applied in novel ways to thinking about generative AI. Now, I'm not kind of saying here naively that I think that we've got AGI around the corner, like some of the kind of tech evangelists are saying, or that we're kind of heading towards kind of self-aware superintelligence or anything like that. I don't think we actually need to be. And that's why the kind of parallel to environmental ethics is so interesting. Because, of course, if we're talking about the sentience or the communication of things like trees or humans with intellectual disabilities, then we don't really need to wait for AI to be super intelligent for us to think about what kind of relationship we might actually need to be involved in with those other beings, if we want to say it that way. And then in particular, for religious ethicists like me, we have a certain body of experience of reflecting on human relationships with non-corporeal beings. So there's an interesting question for me for us to think about how do we actually, can we bring that reflection to these new encounters that we're having increasingly as a part of our everyday lives? That's the third heading. Now, the fourth heading is just to sort of maybe go back to the title and some of the themes that Ali-Reza was raising just a minute ago. Just to wonder, is AI a new religious movement? You can find a really interesting example of this if you haven't already seen it. Google Anthony Lewandowski's Way of the Future, which was an attempt by a kind of tech millionaire, kind of tech bro, to start a new religious movement in the United States focused around deference to super intelligent computers. I think it was completely serious, although you never quite know. But I think we can see in that a really obvious example of what are probably more pervasive in subtle ways orientations. And I'm thinking here also of Balaji Srinivasan's proposal for a network state model, which is more of a new form of social organization enabled by technology and not necessarily overt religious underpinnings. But if you pay attention to the literature coming out of network state people, there are a lot of interesting parallels to religion. And as a scholar of religion, I want to say I'm using the category of mystery cult quite specifically here, because I think if we say that AI is a competing religion, that raises a certain kind of conversation. I don't think that that's actually the case. And here, I think also I might be invoking the problematic but very creative fantasy author Neil Gaiman's book American Gods. So, is AI a new god in the sense that he proposes in that book? And so the mystery cults, as we understand it in the ancient world, weren't religions that competed with the civic religion. So you could still participate in a perfectly straightforward way in Roman civic religion and still be a part of a mystery cult. So it's a different kind of concept of religion, which is non-competitive and pluralistic. Is it possible that we've got something like that in the culture and the industry that's arising around AI? It really does feel like it sometimes. And so I guess that raises interesting questions for religious studies and theology to answer about how to navigate religion and how to judge what's going on in the types of discourses that we see around evangelism and adherence and rituals. So those are my four headings. I'm going to leave it to Dean and Ali-Reza maybe to parse out some specific questions that they want to pull out of there. And I'm happy to go down any of these avenues because I think there's interesting questions under all of those headings. And I'm really excited to see what other people in the room come up with as we go along as well. I'll stop sharing too.
Thank you both so much for your presentations. That was really fascinating to hear both of you speak. I have to be honest, until today, I hadn't really connected the dots between theology and AI. So this has been a real eye-opener for me. It's definitely changed the way I'm looking at all this new tech, and like you alluded to, the tech landscape that's emerging with ChatGPT and Grok and AI. Now, before we open up to audience questions, I'd love to start our discussion with a question of my own, which is, I'm curious, what was the spark? So was there a sort of specific moment or realization where you looked at what was happening in tech and thought, hang on, this is actually a theological issue as well as a tech issue?
You
okay if I go?
first? Yeah, please do.
Probably like GPT 3.5 era. I mean, I've been using the large language models for a long time, including when they were actually pretty crappy and not very threatening. But I think there was an inflection point at which all of a sudden it really felt like you were talking to another form of life, and you knew that it was virtual. There was a kind of projection that you were doing, and you understand the kind of dynamics of sycophancy that are happening there. But nonetheless, to have a meaningful interaction with another, it felt like all of a sudden there was another subject there for me. And I guess it was, and because I'm so steeped in the kind of phenomenological question around subjectivity, that really sort of woke me up and got me thinking, wait a minute, are there other beings that we're bringing into existence here in some way of understanding that word beings? And if that is the case, then my day job really has a lot to ask about how we're treating one another, how I'm reconfiguring my relationships, and what that means for the kind of horizon of the future. So I think that was probably the kind of main inflection point for me. There's others that have happened along the way, but I'm keen to hear what Ali-Reza's got to say.
Yeah, so for me, it was pre the launch of ChatGPT, actually, not very long. So about a year ahead of the launch of ChatGPT, I was invited to participate in a discussion around AI ethics, and partly as an impetus towards decolonizing the discourse around AI ethics, right? So I was invited as somebody who, seemingly works on Islam and ethics, and they wanted a contribution which would help, move away from, the particular discourses which have been informing the development of AI technologies and ethics pre this current boom, right? Um, and as soon as I started thinking, I'm interested in theoretical questions around ethics in the Islamic tradition. I know, I'm always interested in applied cases because they can help us rethink theory, right? So I realized, okay, wow, there's a vast array of questions here which can help me think more carefully about the Islamic tradition itself. Yeah. And that's when I got involved with AI in faith in Seattle. And then, yeah, very, very quickly, within 12 months of me getting involved, we had this mass liftoff of large language models, and the scale of the uptake and the developments, of course, are I'm sure very obvious to the people who are gathered here, right? So there's exciting questions as well as real troubling questions, right? Okay, and so I think there is urgency for discussion and consideration of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a sense, technology, it's kind of it's not just happening in a vacuum. It touches everything, like you've alluded to, with theology, with religion, and the various complications and issues and questions around that. So I think it shapes how we relate to one another, how we make decisions, even how we imagine the future. So the questions it raises aren't just technical or to do with regulation, they're moral, they're even spiritual. So I want to dig a bit deeper here, if I may, drawing on a particular theme that came up a few times in the questions that were sent in before the event. So usually when we talk about AI, at least how I think of it, is that we use engineering or legal frameworks, but sort of plain devil's advocate here, why theology? So if I'm a secular policymaker, for instance, or work in a non-religious institution, what does a theological lens reveal about AI that perhaps a standard ethical framework or technical framework might miss?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So look, so I think one of the key languages which is being used to think about AI ethics is alignment, right? So AI alignment, right? Okay, so how do we align AI technologies with human ends and human goals, right? The beneficial AI. I remember um, and again, it was pre the launch of LLMs or the explosion of LLMs. Ursula van, I can't pronounce her name, the leader of the European Commission, was saying, okay, we need to have human-centric AI. We need guidelines for human-centric AI. All right. How do we do this? The EU Commission basically developed rules and regulation, right? But I think there's some things which are missing within those conversations. So if we're thinking, how do we align AI technologies with human goals and human ends? We need to ask questions about what are human goals and what are human ends, right? Okay, is it simply, the accumulation of more GDP, right, for nation states? Okay, and maintenance of differentials, even where we've got quite concerns about labor and job markets, is it about my own personal material concerns, or is there something more, all right, which we want to be aligning, these technologies to? So I think there are fundamental philosophical, um, and ethical questions about, what do we want these technologies for, right? And what is human purpose? Coming back to a theme which I ended with in my talk. So currently discourse of AI alignment, I think it is seriously thin when it comes to consideration of the actual human ends that we're talking about. And these are overridingly driven by concerns of GDP, state logic, yeah, and now beyond the state, corporate logic.
Yeah, a few thoughts here, and they're a little bit of a jumble. I'll try not to let that mean that I just ramble endlessly. I'm not the kind of theologian who likes to draw a hard distinction between philosophical ethics and theological ethics. I think that there's a lot of kind of transit and interplay across different types of ethics. So in terms of saying, what's the good of theological ethics here, I would say that I wouldn't draw a kind of hard distinction with my friends and colleagues who are doing kind of utilitarian work or virtue-based approaches or ethics of care or any of the other kind of secular or less religious systems or not overtly religious systems, because I think there's lots of kind of overlaps and transit between them. I think probably like Ali-Reza, it's this is a kind of broader what do the humanities have to do in terms of helping us to think about this stuff. And it does help. It is a matter of bringing us back to questions of humanity. I do have a kind of interesting. So I'm intrigued by the levels of anxiety that the discourse around AI has produced. I think there's good reasons for that. I mean, the ecological footprint of the server farms that are currently in production is just completely beyond belief. So the implications are sharp. I get that. I wonder though if a lot of that is coming from the fact that this is embedded in a certain kind of capitalism, which is completely run away, and if the same kinds of the same shape of issues that concern us and bring urgency to these conversations were also there with blockchain, which was the meme, 5 years ago. And you could kind of trace your way back, stepping from one kind of meme to the next. What if generative AI was being developed in a kind of anarchist utopia, and there weren't concerns of commerce? And would we have any concerns at all? And to flip that, are there possibly some rehumanizing potentials here? And I'm thinking especially around AI's assistive technology, and kind of bringing justice and leveling to certain kinds of social situations. People in the disabled community are really excited about generative AI, but often slightly nervous about saying that too loudly, because there's so much moral panic that characterizes a lot of the conversation, or the conversations are so wildly enthusiastic and evangelical that it's hard to kind of find a way in that's more measured. So I don't think we can disentangle it, but I'm curious about what it would look like to focus on this issue in a way that brackets out the critique of capitalism that we all want to bring to it. Is there anything left? Any other kinds of questions to ask? I do think subjectivity is one of the things that stands in there for me. But maybe there are others. And I'm curious what Ali-Reza thinks about that. Like, does our generic critique of capitalism work? Do we need to have a more inflected one here? And possibly does that obscure other kinds of discussion and other kinds of questions that we might need to explore? I think that theology helps us to dig into some of those kinds of maybe unturned stones, but we haven't quite got there yet. But that's maybe a question I want to raise for the panel.
Yeah, so Dean, if I can come back there, actually, I wanted to add something actually. So look, you mentioned something that I've written recently, and actually titled it "Between Fear and Hope." Right? Okay, and so I think AI technologies do bring lots of hope. Okay, and actually we are seeing real positive uptake and developments and so on and so forth, right? And for me, a balance between fear and hope, is potentially productive if it elicits an appropriate ethical response, right? Okay, so we need fear and we need hope as human beings, right? Okay, and when these things are unbalanced, it becomes unproductive. All right. So although maybe I've flagged up anxieties and concerns today, I'm in this position where I think we have hope for these technologies, and there are real fears about these technologies. We do need to do more than. So I agree, Jeremy. We need to do more than just focus on this kind of critique of capitalism and big structures and so on and so forth. Yeah? And this is another place where religious, theological, and philosophical traditions, because I'm on board with Jeremy as well, as not necessarily separating these things out, okay? Yeah, can contribute to the questions. So for example, in AI ethics discourse, we're seeing numerous approaches, regulation from places like the EU, for example, is using rules, right? Okay. And in some ways minimalistic rules, okay. Somewhere like the UK, wants to have a pro innovation policy, and all right, okay, yeah, right. So here, can we get away from capitalism? I'm not sure, all right, but if we look at AI ethicists, you see there's a huge push and revival of virtue discourses, all right, around our use of technology, all right. So how do we develop, techno-moral virtues? And so we're using these virtues in productive ways and flourishing ways, right? So yeah, for me, I think that just like just like Jeremy said that, look, we should be careful about this distinction between philosophical approaches and theological approaches. Yeah, I want to be careful about separating deontological or rules-based approaches and virtue-based approaches. And so for the Islamic tradition in particular, these things are, these types of ethical discourses aren't separate, right? They're often layered. So I think and this is something which I think, an Islamic voice, for example, can bring to these conversations. There's a place for rules, okay, which can be a baseline for society to help us ensure against harm and, oppression and towards justice. And then those can be a baseline for the development of virtues, right? Because most people out there aren't seeking to be virtuous, right? Okay, yeah, in the way theologians or Aristotelian ethicists might hope for, right? So theological traditions, particular philosophical traditions, can bring things to these shared conversations. And from the Islamic case, even on hard discussions around how are we actually going to develop AI ethics, I think it gives us a good model of how you can bring together virtue discourses, and deontological discourses. So theology, philosophy, the humanities has much to contribute.
I think both of those are really fascinating outlooks and contributions. I think picking up on the phrase that Ali-Reza used, aligning AI with human goals, I think that can also sound deceptively reassuring, because humans have these profoundly destructive goals as well as noble ones. And I think that the risk is that we sort of end up building systems that faithfully amplify our worst impulses rather than our highest callings. And of course, the people who currently get to define these goals are usually these large institutions, governments, corporations, which Jeremy alluded to as well, which means alignment talk can easily conceal deep power imbalances, especially for the most vulnerable. So part of the challenge, it seems to me, is not only aligning AI with human values in the abstract, but actually navigating the interplay and friction between these different ethical frameworks without letting the loudest or the most powerful one simply define and dominate the conversation. And I also really like what Jeremy said about AI anxiety. So people feeling this genuine fear and disorientation about work, about privacy, even the meaning of being human now. And I think that feels like more than a technical problem. It's almost pastoral in a way. Is there a role for faith communities and theologians in helping people live with it and interpret this new kind of anxiety? So I just wonder if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would just say agree. Well put, Dean. Yeah, well put.
Yeah, definitely.
And I suppose finally, before we open the floor up to questions, is something more specific to the actual architecture of these systems. We sort of keep hearing about deep learning and systems with billions of parameters. They're getting so complex that not even the code creators can sort of track every connection. And that creates a big problem in AI, which people have probably heard of, called the black box or the black box theory, where even the engineers admit they don't fully understand why the machine made a specific decision, but it just made that decision. So it's a mystery in a way. So I suppose my question then would be on, if I can phrase this correctly, it would be sort of, theology has spent thousands of years being comfortable with the unknown and the unexplainable. Usually science hates mystery. It demands sort of clear explanations. It's built on logic. So my question to you is, do you think theologians are actually better equipped to handle the mystery of AI than the scientists are?
Hope none of my scientist friends are on this call. Do you mind if I jump in, Ali-Reza?
Please.
I hope so. I don't know. There's some interesting questions there around the kind of future direction of AI as well. I think we're looking at specialized models increasingly coming out. I mean, I think of Frank Pasquale has a book, The Black Box Society. And it's quite a helpful commentary. It's probably more than 10 years old now, where he raises a similar kind of question around other kinds of edge technologies. I think mostly in the financial sector, kind of black swans and that kind of stuff, where again, people are developing algorithms, they're measuring the outcomes, they don't really know how they work, but the outcome seems to be good. I mean, that's essentially how most pharmaceutical research works out. You know, someone develops a chemical. Well, what can we use this for? Oh, look, Tylenol makes people's headaches go away. So I think I think the black box thing has very much been a part of scientific exploration in certain niches. I agree with you that there are certain kinds of kind of Baconian forms of science which are very much led through kind of hypothesis and testing. But there is a kind of discovery-led science, which I think probably is mirrored here. And I think computer science as a discipline, I'd be interested to hear if computer scientists disagree with me, emerges out of that exploratory space more than the hypothetical sort of scientific method space in terms of science, if we could bifurcate it in that way. In terms of what theologians have to offer, yeah, I think I might want to agree with you there that there are some elements of uncertainty here, and I'm curious about how we respond in our everyday lives to uncertainty and mystery and overwhelm. Enlightenment philosophers talked about this as the sublime, and that's been kind of picked up in lots of different kinds of philosophical aesthetics. I think we tend to either be awed by things which are beyond us, and maybe tempted to worship them. Maybe that's not a bad thing. I don't know. It depends on the case, I guess. Or to fear and avoid them. And I'm interested in the ways in which our everyday lives are just chock full of mystery and forms of opacity, which maybe we conceal even from ourselves and from one another. So it does feel like a big part of theology is navigating that kind of what we call the via negativa, that is, these kinds of spaces where we don't understand how things work. I'm not entirely sure how that carries us into generative AI, though. What kind of a disposition it would bring us with. I think Ali-Reza is probably right in terms of kind of trying to think about kind of navigating the kind of middle way and recognizing that fear actually is a virtue in a particular kind of way, and that hope is also a kind of orienting factor that needs a certain kind of buoying to others. Ali-Reza, do you want to add maybe or kind of take us in a different direction though?
Yeah, so briefly, because I'm keen to hear other voices as well, right? But I would be hesitant about saying better, all right? So I think theological voices can bring an important, and maybe even necessary a voice to these shared questions, right? Yeah, but to say, well, are theologians better than scientists at engaging at some of these questions? They would approach them differently and they would contribute something differently, all right? And I think we need shared interdisciplinary, engagement with these questions, all right? So that's kind of the first point in terms of dealing with uncertainty. And theological traditions being used to dealing with uncertainty, or as Jeremy's putting it, mystery. I think also just to qualify that, theological traditions have also been, really, really concerned with reason, right? Okay, and rationality. Okay, and maybe too much. And developments now, when we're thinking about, when we're seeing things which are apparently more rational than humans, can help us rethink, what is distinctive about human beings, right? Maybe it's not just reason and power and masculinity, which is, which is better, which is unique about being humans, right? So some of our anxieties about, are we losing human uniqueness when we're seeing technologies which are faster than us or, are better than us at certain tasks and help us think about the distinctiveness of humankind. But that's kind of I'm getting led away from the actual question. What I want to say is that actually religious traditions have been deeply concerned with reason, okay, and rational approaches to dealing with uncertainty. Okay, and rational approaches to dealing with, I think from my engagement with Islamic tradition at least, dealing with questions of accountability and responsibility, right? Not just to an ultimate source, of purpose and direction, but also to each other, right? Okay, yeah, and to creation at large. So theologians and ethicists more generally, I think, can bring those important voices. One more thing about theologians is typically we often try to be systematic, right? Okay, so Christian theologians are often described as systematic theologians, right? So okay, if something's happening over here in my belief system, how does it tie up with other things that I hold, right? Yeah, and I think we need systematic thinking when it comes to AI. All right, so if AI technologies and our development, might be helping us, level up some form of access to education, but it's having this type of destructive, impact on our environment, right? Okay, yeah, we've got a problem. Yeah. So I think theologians, and philosophers more generally, all right, can help with us thinking about these challenges systematically, holistically, and really centering the human, okay, within these conversations about other than the human.
Thank you both for your responses there. I think it'd be a good time to open up the floor to questions. We've got a couple of questions on the chat, which I'll read out first, and then if people want to ask questions, they can put their hand up. I'll put it in the chat. We've got one from Robert, who says, if AI is to help humans to attain their goals, can this be reconciled, for example, to the Westminster Catechism? His question is, number one, what is the chief end of man? And the answer he implies is man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever.
I think this one might be for me, since it's a kind of deep dive Reformed theology question. For those who aren't aware of it, which is probably most everyone here, the Westminster Catechism is a kind of document from the Reformation, particular to Calvinist theology, which is a kind of first principle maybe for saying kind of how do we orient ourselves with the kind of knowledge of the divine person. And so that what the question and answer is the actual format from the Westminster Catechism. There's a little snippet there. I mean, what I would say in a really specifically theological way is that actually the Westminster Catechism and the Reformed theological traditions that arose from it interpret that answer in a wide variety of ways. So some people say, the chief end of humans is to just sort of be worship robots. But the tradition is extended in a lot of ways in terms of thinking about how actually humans can participate in beauty and divinity in a whole wide variety of ways. So there's a lot of Reformed traditions around participation in nature and nature contemplation. In fact, a lot of the environmental movement actually came out of the traditions which were nourished by the Westminster Catechism, strangely, but not strangely. So I'm not sure how much that particular document helps us, because the guidance that it gives actually seems really specific, but once you start to press on it, it gets quite broad and ephemeral. But I mean, there's a good question in there about kind of AI in an instrumental sense, helping us to attain goals. And this takes me back maybe to what Ali-Reza said at the beginning. I think the theological response, probably, at least for me, is, well, what is actually the purpose and meaning of being human? If it's not instrumental, then really we have to rethink what goals are. So if you have a machine that does a certain thing, everything suddenly seems really important in terms of what that machine can achieve for you. But actually, does optimizing all of my music playlists and relabeling all my books and whatever particular task I can achieve at great speed and with great efficiency using a generative AI chatbot actually that important? So I think we come to tasks with an understanding of what is important, and then really, but that's primarily just in terms of thinking them as machines which do tasks for us. Because again, this is about the amplification of our power. It's about human augmentation, and the way that I think we approach any kind of amplification of power is really to discern what are we for? Do we actually need the power? Do we actually need to do anything with it? And what's it for in terms of the broader community of humans and other beings?
Thank you, Jeremy, for that response. We've got another question in the chat, which is from Gabby, who's asking, to what extent can theology help us approach AI critically?
Yeah, so maybe just for balance, I can go here, Jeremy.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so I think that theology can be a really useful critical lens for us to think about AI technologies, all right? And I think it ought to be used, theologies, pluralizing, ought to be used as a critical lens to think about the development of AI technologies. On the flip side, I think theology can also be used as a boon to the uptake of AI technologies, right? So, and these ideas can be used, in competing ways. So yeah, if I spin back to some of the themes I was introduced in my kind of opening remarks, I think theology can help us, and even on building on the last question and response, theology can help us rethink our goals and our purpose, right? So, I mean, if I give a concrete example, because I started really abstract, right? If we think, and this is taking a lead from Jeremy, if we think about using AI technologies and they're not LLMs, okay, to help with the delivery of care, okay, of social care, all right. So I could use a care bot to help me, from an Islamic perspective, right, discharge my responsibility to the elderly, okay, or to take care of the impoverished, right. So I could use AI, I could use AI technologies, automated technologies, and they are being used currently. We're seeing, in care homes, using AI devices to monitor sleep patterns, so that nurses don't have to walk in and disturb the sleep and take observations, right? Every day they're using data, monitoring data, using algorithms to mention, okay, when is there a disruption of sleep and when is there a normal sleep, right? So technology is being used already in a exponentially increasing way to help us with care, right? So okay, yeah, that seems like a really good tool, right? We're improving care, right? But as a theologian or an ethicist, I could ask, right? What's the goal of my duty in Islamic terms for caregiving, right? And I think it's twofold. Yeah, one is actually the function of giving the care, right, and serving the other or caring for the other, but also for my development, I think I need to care, right? So I gain something by looking after the elderly and the young and the less able, right? Okay, if we just devolve all of these duties and rules, and roles to technologies, what are we missing out as human beings, right, in our own developments?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think this is one way where theology can help us think critically, and practically actually about the way we're using these tools.
Thank you very much, Ali-Reza. We've got it's not necessarily a question, it's perhaps an observation, a comment, which is quite a long one, so I'll read it as slowly as I can. It's from Tony, and he says, both Demis and Amode have neuroscience backgrounds. They are both looking to mirror human thinking and thought. Theology takes us down that path. What is the default of human beings but to acknowledge our fallen nature if you're of that religious tradition? And as Reverend Stephen Driscoll, and theologian who wrote Created in Our Image, points out, if we're flawed as human beings, the AI can at best only serve as a mirror to our fallen nature. Early models from Mistral would reflect a strong anti-religious output reflecting their creators. These models, whether Chinese or French, reflect their creators. So theologians need to make the most of the opportunity to hold out their take on situation, because by generating the data, you need to be feeding these models. Culture/traditions who hide their information won't be able to sway the balance of these models. I don't know if any of you have any feedback on that comment.
Yeah, can I go? I've been following Evie and Tony's response as well. So I think this is something that's come up actually in some of the work that I do on virtue ethics, particularly the philosophy of friendship. Sounds obscure, but it'll relate, I promise. There's this tradition, particularly in Greek philosophy, around the purpose of friendship, which holds that it's important for us to have friends that are similar to us, and that image of a mirror actually is used in particular by I think it's Plato or Aristotle, I can't remember, to kind of project a certain kind of understanding of what the purpose of a companion basically in life is. You need to have someone who's similar to you because that's the kind of thing that you can love. And particularly in Greek traditions, friendship is also erotic, but also that's the kind of thing you can relate to, you can be challenged by, you can't be understood by someone who's different from you. I think, okay, so there's lots of different ways to respond to that tradition, but as a Christian theologian, I tend to want to contradict that a little bit and say, actually, friendship with other humans, other beings that are wildly different from us is actually really important. And the purpose of friendship and companionship is not necessarily just to have kind of mimetic encounters. That is, with other creatures, we can perceive and understand the beauty in them because it's similar to us, or because it participates in a kind of understanding of beauty which is so transcendent. Thank you, Tony says Aristotle. So I have a question about kind of how we approach this technology, and this is a question that any of us can, I think, explore in a kind of speculative way, and I've been doing. So we approach generative AI and large language models as an arena for experiencing sycophancy, kind of reflectiveness, similarity. There's absolutely no reason that you can't develop prompts in interacting with chatbots and even do types of training that would get you interactions that are jarring, uncomfortable, contradictory. So there are other ways of training and interacting with chatbots, which doesn't assume that they're going to reflect you back to yourself. So I think in some ways, the fact that we're getting that is the fact that we're asking for it. It's not necessarily embedded in the technology. I mean, there are some ways in which sycophancy is kind of emerges from certain types of training processes and all that. But I wonder if there's an interesting question for us to ask ourselves about what kind of expectations we're bringing to relationships in general. And again, this really relates to some of the problems we're having around loving immigrants and strangers in our culture right now. What is it about the ways that we occupy the world right now which prevent us from encountering difference and feeling excited? So I think that fundamental question, which is a very theological one for me, and maybe rooted in an understanding of difference and human diversity, I think could bring us to thinking about AI in some different ways. We're not going to experience that because that's not what's being offered. But if you self-host models or if you tinker with prompts a little bit, you can get there quite fast. And I mean, I agree with Tony that Sam Altman is really someone I don't want to listen to anymore. The guy's got enough of a platform. I tend to find some really interesting insights coming out of more kind of hobby level communities. So people who are interacting with generative AI on the level of maybe on their PC, they've got a small model, they're tinkering around with prompts, they're doing training. There are people who are doing this kind of experimental interaction and taking AI in totally different directions. I think that's a space that we maybe need to pay more attention to. It offers some interesting questions for us in terms of how we're interacting with and what we're getting out of these things. And I think a theological impulse can take us there. That is that appreciation and anticipation of difference.
Thank you, Jeremy. Ali-Reza, do you want to add anything to Jeremy's comments?
Yes, so kind of Jeremy's given us a useful way to think differently about that question, right? But in terms of going back to the question, so from an Islamic tradition, don't necessarily have a doctrine of the fall, all right? But of course have accept human fallibility, right? Okay, yeah, I mean, we don't need religious scriptures to tell us that humans are flawed. Okay, right? Yeah, we can see it around us. Yeah? So, okay, AI technologies are mirroring some of those flaws, but I think they're also amplifying some of those flaws, right? Okay, and they're amplifying. So again, you're making this a really good point here that okay, look, theologians need to get their information out there, right? Because at the moment, what's happening is we're getting amplification of particular knowledge systems and particular assumptions. Yeah, and that's really problematic for discrimination and for inequalities, right? So again, even if we're going to step away again from LLMs, Jeremy's nodding. So I think for LLMs, it's quite obvious, right? The information which these data sets are relied upon are particular. Okay, and they're amplifying in authoritative ways, and particular discriminations. But we've got, data discrimination problems across AI technologies. So again, if we think about healthcare systems, what early uptake of AI technologies have been used for diagnostic, speeding up diagnosis of pigmented lesions, right? Okay, now, you've got algorithms which are trained on, vast arrays of pigmented lesions, is it a freckle or is it cancerous? Okay, now they're trained on vast sets of data. All right, okay, and they can improve the efficiency of detecting cancer. All right, okay, more than a trained ophthalmologist or a cancer specialist. All right, statistically showing so. But the data is largely trained on Caucasian images. All right, so a freckle on a Caucasian skin looks very different from others. All right, so it will improve detection, and early treatment. So the use of those technologies are improving detection and early treatment, of cancers. All right, on for Caucasians, but will increase the inequalities, for non-Caucasians. All right, so yeah, AI is flawed, humans are flawed, right? Okay, yeah, the average doctor is flawed, all right? They're not perfect, they don't get them all right, okay? Yeah, but I think we have risks within our current technologies of amplifying some of our flaws, and we need to be attentive to those issues.
Thank you, Ali-Reza. We've got a reflection from Evie who says, I wonder if it could be argued that people might use AI at times in order to cope with uncertainty. For example, asking ChatGPT numerous questions in order to receive instantaneous and affirmative answers. This seems like a key difference between AI and the analogy to God. God's answers to our prayers are not necessarily neatly packaged, affirmative or instantaneous. Instantaneous. Have either of you got anything to add to Evie's reflection?
Yeah, I mean I'm noticing there's a kind of a symmetry with the question that Helen's raised just a couple of posts later, wondering about whether there's some ways that AI has a place in liberation. And so I was thinking about that when you were reading that question, and I think there's some interesting implications one of the things that I think theology the everyday does, that's really helpful and interesting, is thinking about things like prayer and interacting with non-corporeal beings, or interacting with forms of subjectivity that aren't actually present to us in a kind of physical way. So we have quite a lot of experience casting into the deep and wondering about kind of what kind of effect that has on us spiritually and psychologically, and how you can do that in a way that's responsible and meaningful for you. I mean, and that kind of carries for lots of kind of magic and ritual systems. But I'm not sure that I would say that interaction with the divine is necessarily about silence. I mean, there's lots of different possible angles, but I mean, if we kind of take a kind of Christian theology line that the kind of primary relationship between the creator and the created is one of love, and that the kind of concept of love is the all-pervasive kind of guiding principle for being a being, it feels like actually there's lots of kind of strange similarities in terms of the ways that we can interact with like chatbot therapists, for example, and the kind of affirmation. I don't know. I mean, this gets me towards this wondering though, what would it feel like if we were interacting with AI in a way that was negative? Would there be salience and edification there for us as well? Different kinds that we're not experiencing? Maybe, probably. I'm really interested in this question about liberation, though, because I do think that, especially when we're talking about disability studies, technology has been a really important part of thinking about disability. And so there's a whole conversation that I don't feel is actually really being had, even on campuses, where we're trying to develop policies to think about how we guide students and colleagues around AI use, which really takes into account the concept of assistive technology and the role that technology plays in creating creating equality where it doesn't exist, and confronting inequality. So I think there's some really interesting possibilities here. It feels like we're worried about people cheating or skiving or whatever that's kind of in the foreground. And so I really like this question about liberation, because I do think that's not really part of the discussion as much as it should be. And this is something where I, as a theologian, a liberation theologian, actually, am really quite passionate for us to think about whether there are ways that we can use these as tools of liberation, and how we can frame that concept of liberation for people who are experiencing oppression as part of a more regular part of our discourse. Not the people who have enough money to afford it, not the people who can use it to transform industries like the government's current strategy. But how can this be liberatory and relieve situations of oppression? I think is a quite key concept, and could be really important for the ways we talk about this in education even.
Thank you, Jeremy, for answering Helen's question. I thought we'd just finish off with Niall's question, and then we could open up the floor and see if there's anyone wants to ask any further questions. He says, I'm curious whether there are fundamentally different ways of understanding AI in particular religious traditions or the languages of particular religious traditions. Although not originating from a religious tradition, at least I don't think, I recently read the Chinese term for AI, Rengong Zingeng, if I've probably mispronounced that, translates to human-made intelligence, which arguably challenges the way we are in an Anglophone world might think about AI as something artificial or other to outside of humanity. So he's wondering if either all of you had any thoughts about that.
Nice question, and I saw that actually. That question it came in before as well, actually. So sorry for just jumping in there, Jeremy.
No, go.
All right. So the Arabic term which is being used for artificial intelligence is al-aql al-istina'i. All right. Yeah, and in some cases, aql, I might translate it as reason or rationality. Yeah, istina'i is like, is something which has been manufactured. All right. So it's a manufactured form. All right. Okay. Yeah. And that's, if you like, for the artificial element, right? So a manufactured form of intelligence. Sometimes people are using not the word al-aql, which has this sense of intellect or reason, which has got rich histories, in European thought and Abrahamic thought and Islamic thought. All right. And not necessarily, flattened to our modern senses of rationality. Sometimes, in Arabic, they're using a similar term, which is distinct of a dhikar. All right. So this is a sense of something which resembles reason. All right. And maybe this has got some, there's some cultural or theological assumptions about wanting to distinguish and maintain that there's there's something distinct about human reason. Okay, because human reason within Arabic and Islamic traditions is not seen as separate from the heart. It's a function of the soul. And is it's the seat of revelation. It's the place for logical thinking, and it's also the faculty through which emotion arises as well, right? So I think Arabic discourse has this. You can see something different about the way they're positioning this language. But interestingly, to just use it as a pivot to come back, you can see Muslim majority states, especially in the Gulf, being really fast adopters. Okay, you have artificial intelligence, and using them in ways which really challenge, what I would say, even from an Islamic perspective, are questions around ethics, privacy, security, and securitization, right? So, I think we will. They've been early adopters. We're talking about smart cities in places like Dubai and Qatar and Saudi, all right? Okay, and many of the ways technologies are being used, okay, are informed by cultural and religious specificity, but some of the broader issues really are shared issues around security, risk, surveillance, privacy, so on and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, I really like the way that the question's frame presses us to think about intersubjectivity. And the kind of how the linguistics conditions the ways that we approach the question of intersubjectivity. Is this something artificial? Is this something like me? Is this something opposed to me in my kind of form of my ontology or whatever? I'm really keen for us to situate our reflections on AI in everyday context. And this is something Ali-Reza and I are both quite passionate about, thinking about the everyday as a context for ethical thinking, as opposed to the often quite elite and rarefied context in which we do ethics. I think we need that because there are like genuine security questions and questions around political international relations, which I think pertain. But I do think we need more of thinking not just about how AI can be part of your home, but how your kind of domestic, everyday experience of the world can be an arena for moral deliberation on the status and the kind of experience of these technologies. And so I'm keen for us to do more everyday ethics. And I think that's kind of the direction you're taking us in. How does this thing relate to me and my kind of everyday would be the place where I would put that. And maybe, I don't know. There's just a lot of different directions to take this. I think cross-cultural analysis, as well as you're suggesting, is really important. in terms of how we're understanding the way that the uptake here is. Because I think especially in the kind of Silicon Valley, London axis, sometimes struggles to see the kind of wider view in terms of how we can receive these things and think about them ethically.
Thank you, Jeremy. Does anybody want to ask a question directly to either of our speakers? If so, you can raise your hand on Teams. Probably got time for one more question. Freeman, you've got your hand up if you want to ask your question to either of our speakers.
Yes, hello, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Great. Thanks very much for the conversation. It's been quite interesting. I think that one of our top priorities is to understand ourselves better, both individually and collectively. I think that the better we know ourselves, the better choices of orientations we can make. It was mentioned that AI is derivative from past data, along with warnings and arguments against AI. I think we can make the same arguments for humans. We are derivative from the past data. Looking at societies, we are far from utilizing the full extent of our potentiality. And this has, of course, a lot to do with where we have come from, all the wars, the transgenerational traumas, and so on and so on. And we are aware that we are so biased, and we cannot even help it, like even if we know that we are biased, right? We have a limited perspective, and it's very challenging to approach impartiality, objectivity, etc. So I think that even though I acknowledge that the AI is built from data that are available or is being fed to it, nevertheless, I feel that I would trust it much more to be objective than the majority of people. And ultimately, I feel that AI is already help us approach objectivity, potentially bridge some of our differences, overcome barriers, overcome many of our conflicts. And I agree that, especially in the short term, it can amplify discrimination. People might lose their jobs, and there will be, and there are already some negatives. But I feel that the more the data is collected, and the more the system is self-correcting, and the more we also try to continue to make a conscious effort to include ethical frameworks, I feel that it is inevitable that it will have a positive long-term impact. And that's sort of my view. And yeah, if you can tell me what you feel about that.
You want to go, Jeremy?
I don't know if I've got any if I've got any thoughts on this. Actually, I'm kind of my brain is kind of running around in circles. Do you want to?
Okay, so look, I appreciate, and I do also have some of the similar hopes that you have for these technologies. To be honest with you, I think AI technologies and technology more generally helps us overcome many human problems. Yeah, and I liked the way that you just positioned that actually look, some of the limits to AI technologies are also we're also limits to humans, right? We're also reliant on a history, we're also biased, so on and so forth. Yeah. So I think that's really solid point of view, actually. One of the things that I was flagged up that I was concerned about is, okay, are AI technologies amplifying, okay, some of those limits? And your optimistic view is that, look, as things improve, we can help refine them. Yeah. And so, yeah, I hope so. Right. I hope so. Okay. I would just I share your hopes, actually. Right. But I would just my point of caution in response to that comment was the objectivity that we're ascribing to AI technologies. All right. And I think AI literacy is just and I'm not a technologist. Okay. Yeah. But because I've been, had a privilege of working with technologists over the last few recent years, I've learned just a little bit. Right. Okay. About how these technologies actually work. All right. And for my understanding, LLMs are predictive. Okay. Yeah. They generate. Okay. So they're not taking objective views. And actually their creativity and their magic, right, is in the weightings which allow them to move away from predictions, right? So I think to ascribe objectivity to, even if we get away from concerns about personifying AI technologies. I think when we ascribe objectivity to large language models, we were in trouble actually, right? So I think us understanding these technologies, and I'm including myself here, and very, very well, so that we can appropriately understand best use cases as well as the right ethical questions for the vast range of AI technologies which are emerging, is really, really important. Okay, and maybe that comes back to one of the comments I had before, and that's why we don't just need theologians and philosophers. Actually, we need theologians and philosophers and technologists working together on these things, so we can learn together and hopefully help, kind of speed up some of those hopes that you shared.
Thank you, Ali-Reza. So we're pretty much nearly out of time. This has gone really, really quick, and it's been really, really great to hear all these contributions, and of course our speakers. So to kind of wrap this up, I sort of want to go back to the core title of the event, which is our new God, AI. So my question really is, if AI continues to advance, if it gets smarter, faster, more creative than us, what do you think could be the one thing left that remains uniquely human? In other words, what is the one thing a machine will never be able to do that we must protect?
This comes up a lot in the conversations that I have around animal ethics, because people are often quite keen to think in kind of with forms of reasoning around exceptionalism, like, well, okay, well, but what's the human thing? How are we different? And I tend to say, actually, we're probably just animals. I don't know. I don't think I would want to say that there's something special about humans, except that we are perhaps the most fallible of all the creatures on this terrestrial sphere. And the rest of the creatures are kind of watching us and waiting for us to catch up and figure out how to get along with each other and to care for one another and to care for the earth. So I wouldn't want to say we want to hold on to our fallibility, but I do think there are ways to bring humility to the ways that we think about AI. And so I think maybe that might be the place I would want to leave it here, in as much as we have it, and when we do have it. Humility born of being fallible and helpless and frail is actually quite an important part of being human, even though we don't like it very much and we rarely talk about it.
Dean, I just missed the question actually because I was reading the chat. All right. I wonder if you would mind just repeating actually.
Yeah, it was sort of, my question was sort of along the lines of, if AI continues to get smarter, faster, more creative, what's the sort of one thing that's left which keeps us uniquely human? So, what's the one thing that a machine can never do as well as us, or entirely that we can do, which we must then protect and really say, this is what makes us special and unique?
Yeah. All right. Okay. So I thought that was the question, hearing Jeremy's response, right? So I think I would align here with Jeremy that I'm less concerned with human uniqueness than some other theologians, right? But I think that the developments that AI technology is showing in issues of rationality and speed and efficiency, can help us re-embrace the broader potentiality of human beings, right? Okay, so there's more to being human than processing data and having knowledge, okay, or having information. Yeah. So I would like to use this as these developments as a mirror for us to embrace the breadth of human potentiality. Okay, without us having to think about it being distinct. Yeah. So, okay, if we're seeing certain qualities, which we thought were human, emerging in non-humans, and that's making us anxious, right? I think that can remind us that there's more to being human, okay, than simply those qualities, and maybe it's those, non-rational qualities that we really need actually, to think about broader human goals and AI alignment and ethics and justice and liberation and so on and so forth that we've been talking about.
Thank you, Ali-Reza. So unfortunately, we will have to draw it to a close. It's going really, really quickly. And I think myself, indeed, I'm sure many other people will feel the same, that we sort of left with more questions than we came in with, which I think is exactly the point. We've sort of started to peel back the layers of the black box, and I think it's clear from both Jeremy and Ali-Reza who have spoken that, and of course all the other contributions in the chat as well, that it's clear that theology has this massive role to play in that process. So myself, and I'm sure everybody else would like to say a massive thank you to Ali-Reza and Jeremy for guiding us through this complex territory with clarity, and thank you for all the contributions, and for the audience for challenging us and questioning and giving us, giving their reflections. What I will do is I will send the recording out for people who weren't here and people who want to catch up again on the recording, and I'll also send out any publications and a thank you note via email to those who were present today. So again, thank you to our two presenters, and thank you for everyone for being here today.
And thanks for getting us organized, Dean. Really grateful to you for putting this all together.
Yeah. Many thanks, Dean, and many thanks to everybody in the, for engaging. And apologies if I misconstrued anybody's questions as well. I got a clarification there. So, humans are limited, right? And me especially. So thank you all.
It's been a real pleasure. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice night.